What is antique? What is vintage? What is retro? So, I've been doing some research into this because as I've been gathering some old toys and some old comics together for you to have a look at, it occurred to me that I'd never really looked into this topic in terms of trying to classify what it is that I'm buying. Are they vintage toys? Are they retro items? Do any of them qualify as antiques? Um, Pretty much one of the oldest things that I have in my house is this book. It dates from the mid 1950s. It's Winnie the Pooh. It wasn't mine originally; it was my mum's. But because it dates from the 1950s, it isn't antique. Because my understanding from what I've read is that antiques have to be at least 100 years old. So there's quite a clear objective definition of what an antique is. And that isn't it. And the vast majority, of course, of toys that we get these days are not antiques yet because they're just not from that far back. So that led me to consider what vintage means. And vintage seems to mean things that are sort of about 20 years old or older, but obviously stopping, I guess, when you get to the antique mark, when they've then become antique. So a vintage store, you would expect to be selling things from, about 20 years back. So, probably things that you can't really get anymore in their original form in the shops, probably. So, when I then looked at what retro means, retro is quite an interesting one because I think for me, retro boils down to the sort of feeling that something evokes in you. And that is what determines whether you feel personally it's retro or not. Now, that obviously is very subjective. So the objective version of that I've seen is that retro is an item that was produced in the last 20 years or so. And if it was produced then its presentation in the modern day would then be retro by that sort of definition. Which is interesting because that means that its presentation in the modern day may hark back to when it was originally produced, or it may be the original item. So you may have a retro item which is retro by virtue of it being of that age, or it may be retro in that it is copying or paying homage to the style of 20 or so years ago. So when you think of sort of, reproduction transformers, for example, they're actually from more than 20 years ago when you think about it. Like the G1 transformers, they're pretty old, but we still view those as being sort of, the modern reproductions are kind of retro toys, I suppose. But actually, they're probably more vintage toys these days. But I think that the new molds of the original characters that you see are probably retro because they're newly produced versions. So you can't call them genuinely retro or genuinely vintage because the actual items themselves are brand new. They are just modelled on the original toys. So I think that's an interesting sort of distinction between the two because you can have modern retro toys, and you can have, obviously there are original retro toys, and there's also the 3D printing question, of course, as well, where you're sort of effectively producing your own version of older toys. So is that then a retro toy, or is that just a modern reproduction? And, how then do you sort of interpret the value difference between all of those different variations? Because the aim is still to evoke something that you have had at a time in your life, which it was at that point current to you then. So something that's vintage might well be something that you'd never actually owned. when it was first out. I think retro items are items that you did own when they first came out, but are just not being currently produced now. So on that basis, I guess that if I wanted something retro, I would kind of expect it to be the original retro, so the original item as it was produced when I had it, rather than a modern reproduction of it. But then I can also see the argument the other way to say that something retro is also something that evokes the feeling of the original product. So, I'd be interested to understand what other people think of this as sort of conceptually, sort of what matters most to you. Is it the way the thing makes you feel? Is it the actual physical age of the object, or do you lie somewhere between the two? What sort of difference does it make price wise for you personally? Are you happy to pay more for something because it's older, or would you prefer to pay less for a good modern reproduction of it, even if you know it's not actually the same one that you handled when you were a kid? Open question. There is no right or wrong answer to that, I don't think, although I'm sure there's a lot of passionate debate about both things. And I was thinking about my own experience with it, in so much as I got a dinky Space 1999 Eagle the other day, and the freighter version of that toy comes with little tiny yellow plastic canisters that were supposed to carry radioactive waste in the show. And I actually got one that came with those, but they were missing the label. So I thought that, as a matter out of interest as much as anything else, I would buy some reproduction barrels which included stickers and see if they sort of matched up to the originals. And they almost did. They were pretty good, and in some ways they improved on the originals because they actually fit better into the pod than the original canisters did, but they weren't quite the same shape and size because of that, in part, I think. And I was kind of sort of, well, yes, they look pretty much the same. They're serving the same purpose, but they don't feel like the originals to me. And it didn't matter because I'm not a diehard in that respect, and they didn't have to be exact in order for them to display in pretty much the right way. But there was just something about that for me that took me out of it a little bit, if that makes sense. So I can completely see, a completely valid way to make something display properly, and yet, in terms of sort of the emotion behind it, I guess just a little bit different. So as I say, I'd just be interested to see what people think on this one, really, because I think it must be a topic of sort of lively debate in collecting circles. And I was thinking about comics, because comics have their own sort of definitions in terms of their age and their quality and everything else. And I think that's probably a topic for a whole different video. It's one I'm sort of passingly aware of, but I couldn't give you the lowdown on it, really. And I'm sure there are other videos out there that could give you that sort of information if you're interested. But just to be aware, comics have different ages, and they've also got different quality ratings as well. So there's all sorts of other things that apply to comics as items. But I was just sort of interested in the general classification of retro, antique, vintage items, rather than books and comics and so on, for the purposes of this video. But let me know in the comments and comments rather whether this is of interest to you, and do like and subscribe. Cheers for now.